Hey everyone, going to take a little time here to go through the lesson on using sources and avoiding plagiarism. Um, Quite possibly one of the most important lessons of the whole course. All right. Right here, start the show. Whew, such an important lesson here because we're going to go over what we mean by plagiarism because it often entails much more than students realize. And you need to understand all the different ways that plagiarism can show up, why it is so important to not plagiarize, and other ways that you could misuse your sources that will put you in a bad spot as you're working on the course project. All right, so first things first. We all know that research papers require you to gather and use source material in your essay. However, for this class, you do not want to make the mistake of thinking your essay should be all or mostly source material. This essay is your essay, your ideas and main points. For this class, a good rule to follow is 80% of your essay should be your own words and ideas. 20% or less of the essay should come from source material. And I will say this again later, but I'm going to say it now. My best piece of advice for how to ensure that you are sticking to that ratio is once you have done all of your research and you know which sources you're going to use and you know exactly what information you're going to use from each source, put it aside. Sit down and write the essay from start to finish without looking at any of your sources. Make sure that you have an introductory paragraph that is all you, with a thesis statement that is all you, that you have main points discussed in the body paragraphs, and that the support and the ideas and the explanations for each main point are all you, that you have a concluding paragraph that is all you. Then bring your sources back over and start adding them in where appropriate. You might have to change a little bit here and there to integrate the source material properly, but at least in doing so, you will ensure that the majority of the essay is yours and that you have only used a minimal amount of source material to help support your ideas. That's my biggest piece of advice for right now. Why do we use source material? What purpose does it serve? It gives credibility to the points that you make throughout the essay. But the sources are only there to help back up what you are presenting in the essay. It is not just regurgitating what other people have already said. You want to have your own ideas about your topic and then simply use minimal source material to show that your ideas are sound, they are solid, that they are credible, right? And using good source material shows a respect to the reader and a respect to the topic and establishes your own credibility that you have done careful research. So you do need the source material, but you don't want the source material to overpower the essay and overshadow you. Okay? Writing with poor use of sources, it's going to read like a string of unconnected facts, unsupported opinions, or undigested quotations. It's just going to look like quote after quote after quote, citation after citation after citation. And if you're not careful, you run the risk of some of it not even making sense or contradicting itself. You also run the risk of some of those source items being taken out of context or distorted. And at the worst, it's going to end up being plagiarism. But if you have a strong use of sources, and strong, again, not meaning that the too much of the paper is from sources, it's just strong use of sources, it will center on your ideas that are advanced through thoughtful engagement of your sources. It will offer logical analysis. It will be built on reliable information from quality sources that have been treated with respect, but haven't been overused. We talked about this briefly in the previous lesson. We're going to talk about it a little more right here, and then you'll actually get practice at doing these things in week 5. But there are 3 ways you can use sources. You can provide a summary of a source, which is where you capture the author's principal idea, the overall main idea of that source. It's typically used when you want to provide a general overview, not specific details, because a summary will not include specific details. It will simply include the overall main idea. If you summarize a source, you still have to provide an in-text citation. Oh. You can paraphrase a source, which is where you take a smaller section of the source and you use your own words to express the same idea that the original author did. Again, you express the same idea, but in a totally different way. Paraphrasing is what you should aim to use most in your research paper, because if you're putting it in your own words, it makes it so much easier to integrate it and include it in the paragraph without it seeming choppy or like it just appeared out of nowhere. It becomes a part of your writing. If you paraphrase a source, you have to provide an in-text citation. Oh, you can also use a direct quote, which is where you use the author's exact words. This should really only be done sparingly, and only when you feel like the author's words are so perfect or are so complicated that they can't really be reworded like you would for a paraphrase. Most students want to only use direct quotes in their papers, and that is what you should use the least of, because very rarely are you going to be dealing with an idea that can only be expressed the way the original author expressed it. Those exact words are the only way I can convey this information. That is hardly ever the case. In almost every scenario, there is a way to paraphrase that information and say the same thing in a different way. But if you come across something that is worded so well, or it is kind of complex, and you feel like a direct quote is needed, you put the whole thing in quotation marks from beginning to end of the exact words that you have lifted from the original source. It could be just one word. It could be a phrase. It could be a whole sentence, maybe 2 or more sentences. If it's a longer passage that you're quoting, which there should really be no reason for that in a paper of this magnitude that you'll be writing. It's only a 4 to 5 page paper. There are ways to do that though. But no matter what, if you have used a direct quote from a source, you must provide an in-text citation, always. So 3 different ways that you can incorporate source material. But what do each of them have in common? They must always have an in-text citation. What this tells us is, it does not matter how you incorporate that source material. You must always cite it. Anything that you use from a source, anything, has to be cited. It has to be an in-text citation. That's the part in parentheses, right? You'll often see it at the end of a sentence when you're reading, and it'll have an author's last name and a comma and then a year. That's a citation. You have to provide a citation anytime you use material from a source, no matter how you use it. We will have a whole lesson just on citations in week 4. So you will learn how to do it, but you just need to realize right now that citations are absolutely non-negotiable, no matter how you have chosen to incorporate source material. Failure to provide the citation is plagiarism. So let's keep going and we'll learn even more about that. What is plagiarism? It's a lot of different things, believe it or not. It is using someone else's words, using someone else's ideas, using someone else's images, and making them appear as if they're yours. It is using source material, whether it is in print or online, doesn't matter. It is using source material without acknowledging the source. It is theft, and it refers to a range of thefts. Submitting a paper that you didn't write yourself. Having a friend write it for you, using a friend's essay who took the class previously, paying a website to write the essay for you, plagiarism. Pasting large chunks of a source into your paper and passing it off as your own, right? So like there's paragraphs in your essay, and there, I'm looking at one paragraph of your essay, and like 75% of that paragraph came word for word from one of your sources. You didn't put it in quotes, and you didn't provide a citation. That's plagiarism. Summaries, paraphrases, and direct quotes without proper documentation or citation. That's plagiarism. Using the exact words of a source without quotation marks, even if you have provided a citation, is plagiarism. So you took something word for word, it was a direct quote. Direct quotes are supposed to be in quotation marks. You typed out the direct quote, but forgot the quotation marks. You provided the citation in parentheses afterwards, but you forgot the direct quote. You forgot the quotation mark. Plagiarism. Because that citation lets me know that that information came from that source. But because there's no quotes, it tells me you paraphrased it. So those are your words. Your source's idea, your words. But that's not the case. Even the words themselves came from your source, which is why you're supposed to put them in quotes. If you fail to provide the quotes, it's plagiarism, because you're passing something off as yours that isn't, right? Using the exact phrasing or sentence structure of a source, even if you put most of it in your own words. So you're reading the sentence and you're just plugging in synonyms for each word, almost like you're using a thesaurus to change each word along the way, but the order of the ideas is still the same. Plagiarism, even if there's a citation. Putting citations in the wrong spot, which is failing to distinguish between your ideas and the source material, plagiarism. The wide variety of instances that can manifest as plagiarism, and not everyone is aware that each of these instances is in fact plagiarism. Sadly, I do get a couple of these every so often, submitting a paper that the student didn't even write, finding it on the internet, buying it. They've been caught. It happens. Pasting large chunks of a source and trying to pass it off as their own. Get quite a few students who try to do that. They get caught. Summarizing, paraphrasing, and using direct quotes without citations. That happens. They get caught. Using a direct quote, but forgetting to put the quotation marks, even though they provided a citation, that happens. That one is a much easier fix, though. It's not quite as much of a, like, oh my gosh, you really messed up kind of moment. It's a, don't forget, this came word for word from your source. So even though you have the citation, you still have to put the quotation marks around it. Easy fix. But if you don't fix it, then it's plagiarism. A lot of people using this one, the second one right here, using the exact phrasing or sentence structure of a source, even if they've changed the words technically. I get that a lot. That's a big one. And students have to really go back and redo a lot of their draft when this happens. Putting citations in the wrong place so that it's hard to tell what part of the paragraph is actually the student's idea and what part of the paragraph actually came from the source material that they provided a citation for. But, when I go to that source, where they put the citation is after a sentence that didn't come from the source. It came from the author themselves, the student themselves, and the information that actually came from the source was before that. So they just put the citation in the wrong spot and made it confusing. That happens pretty often as well. And I hope what you're gathering from this, my little explanation here, is that some of these are done on purpose. Some of these are unintentional. I try to teach students what it is, what plagiarism consists of, all the different ways it can manifest, so that they can try to avoid having any of these happen in their rough draft. But I read your drafts thoroughly. I go to every source that you list on your reference page. I run the entire paper through a plagiarism program. And I spend a good 2 to 3 hours at least on each rough draft. So the more you understand plagiarism, what it is, how to avoid it, the quicker the turnaround will be when I grade your rough draft. I don't grade it. When I review your rough draft, and the less backtracking you'll have to do when you go to make revision. Because if this happens, submitting a paper you didn't write yourself, you're starting from scratch already. And we will be in week 7 by that point. Pasting large chunks and trying to pass it off as your own. You're almost going to be starting from square one there also. Already in week 7. Using summaries, paraphrases, and quotes without citations, you're not necessarily having to go all the way back to square one in that case, but you're still having to spend a whole lot of time trying to go back and find which source did I use here and which one did I use there. It can be time consuming and confusing. So it's much better to provide the citations as you draft so that you don't run that risk. Using the exact words of a source and forgetting the quotation marks, that one is a bit of an easier fix. But again, if you don't fix it, then you get points taken off for plagiarism on the final draft. Using the exact sentence structure, that can be a tough one too. But I will teach you a method for paraphrasing that includes a step where you change the structure. So if you use the method that I teach you in week 5, hopefully you can avoid this instance as well. And it's one of the more common ways that plagiarism shows up in student writing. I just want to be clear that I find these errors, I find these offenses more often than I would like, but I find them, and you have to fix them if you want to score well enough on the final draft on project part 4 to be able to pass the class. So please take this seriously and understand what plagiarism is. Why is it serious? It's academic dishonesty. It is cheating. It is trying, whether intentional or not, it can end up as a failing grade on the assignment or the course. It can be noted on your academic transcript. It can even lead to being expelled or terminated from a program. We've had some borderline cases in the past. It's also unfair to your classmates who are doing their own work. It's disrespectful to the field, to the instructors. It's just not a nice thing to do. Do the work yourself. You get to choose the topic. You get to find your own sources. Do responsible research writing. How do we avoid plagiarism? Well, the first step is not really listed on here, but the first step is understanding all of the different ways that plagiarism can occur. But don't procrastinate or wait until the last minute, because when we get rushed, several things can happen. First, we could panic. And when we are panicked and fearful, we tend to make rash decisions, which could include paying for an essay, finding a random essay online, or just trying to patchwork sections of source material, hoping the instructor doesn't realize it. The other thing that waiting until the last minute can lead to is unintentional plagiarism, because you're just rushed and you're just not being as careful as you should be. Another way to avoid plagiarism is making sure you take orderly, accurate notes, that you have documented your sources, right? That's where the annotated bibliography is going to come into play. You're going to have to do that for project part 2. where you give the reference entry for the source, a brief summary of the source, and a brief explanation of how you plan to use that source. I'm going to make you do that in project part 2. The problem, though, is that, project part 2 comes in week 4, and you need a minimum of 3 sources for this paper. But there's no guarantee that as you continue working on the project, that you will keep just those 3 sources. You might decide, I don't actually really, now that I think about it, now that I'm starting to get into this draft, this first source really isn't all that great. I need to find another one instead. But now I haven't looked at it. You haven't recorded it for an assignment. And then you run the risk of not having orderly, accurate notes or documenting it appropriately. And that's, not saying that the 3 sources that you have on project part 2 have to be the only 3 sources you use for the paper. I'm just saying that I'm going to force you to do it for project part 2. But if you end up changing any of those sources or adding more sources, make sure that you do that for those new sources as well. Working carefully with source material in your paper means keeping track of where you're using it in the paper, making sure that you are providing the citation in the correct spot, making sure that you are using if you're using a direct quote, that you really are taking word for word and you're not leaving anything out or adding anything in. Just working carefully. That is how you avoid plagiarism. All right. We have a couple of scenarios here. Is it plagiarism? All right. So our first scenario, you write a paper on the legalization of marijuana for your first year seminar. You save the paper, make a couple changes, and hand it in for your political science course. Could it be considered academically dishonest? Is it plagiarism? The answer, it could be. Submitting the same paper for 2 different classes, it's your own work, but at the same time, it could be academically dishonest if your instructors aren't aware of what you're doing. Most classes expect that you will do new work for that course. Not every instructor will be like that, though, so it's worth approaching the instructor and saying, hey, I have this paper that I wrote for whatever. I think it would work really well for this class as well. Can I use it? You never know what the instructor is going to say. All right. But just know that technically it is academic dishonesty. Next scenario. Your professor, your instructor, discusses some interesting ideas in today's lecture on Plato. You decide to use your lecture notes in your paper. Could this be considered academically dishonest? Probably not, but it could be if you don't cite the notes. Just because it's an instructor doesn't mean that you don't have to give credit to the source. You still need to give credit, and there's a way to do that. But it's not your idea. It was your instructor's idea. You have to give them credit if you're going to use those ideas in your paper, right? Okay. Next scenario. In a paper on the history of hate speech in America, you find this passage in a fall 2001 article in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy written by Jennifer E. Rothman. So the passage that you find, right, says, the law surrounding threats has gained recent attention from commentators after decades of virtual anonymity and unaddressed confusion among the lower courts. The sudden interest in threats has been sparked primarily by the proliferation of widely disseminated internet speech. You decide to use this quote as is. You're going to use this quote in your paper. Is this plagiarism? We've got, it's in quotes. We have a citation. It looks good. Is it plagiarism? Probably not. However, one thing to check though is that you fully understand what this passage says. Because we've got some, phrases and words and terms that we don't necessarily use on an everyday basis, words like virtual anonymity, proliferation, dissemination. You need to make sure that you understand the terminology and the intent of the passage so that you are using this information accurately and responsibly. Otherwise, just in a general sense, it wouldn't be plagiarism because you've got the quotes and you've got the citation. You just have to make sure that you understand the passage and you're using it appropriately. What about this scenario? You're going to paraphrase this passage, the one on hate speech. Because you're like, yeah, I understand what it says, but that's just weird. I really don't want to, have virtual anonymity and proliferation and disseminated in my paper. It just sounds too stuffy and pretentious. So maybe it's best if I just paraphrase this and put it in my own words. So again, here's the original. Here's your paraphrase. The law surrounding threats have gained notoriety lately after many years of virtual anonymity and unsolved confusion among the lower courts. The sudden interest in threats has been raised mostly by the increase in internet use to spread messages. You have the citation. So you're giving credit to the source, but is it plagiarism? Yes. This is plagiarism. Why? Because even though we have given the citation, you have still plagiarized the sentence structure, right? The law surrounding threats has gained recent attention. The law surrounding threats has gained notoriety. This part is all still the same. And even if you change the words a little, you're still presenting the ideas in the exact same order as the original author. And you have to do it in a completely different way. Again, you're going to learn some steps, a process for how to do that. Just keep this in mind. This is still plagiarism because it is still too similar to the original. What about this? We have this passage here. How many of the world's top 100 sexiest women have tattoos? FMH magazine published their annual list of the 100 sexiest women in the world 2002 as voted on by their readers. The poll offers a fascinating insight into the popularity of tattoos among female celebrities. A quick look at the top 100 list reveals that one of the things that many of the women picked have in common is body art, i.e. tattoos. This is how the student decided to use this information, use this passage in their paper. Many of the world's top 100 sexiest women have tattoos. 2 years ago, FMH magazine published their annual list of the 100 sexiest women in the world as voted on by their readers. The poll offers a fascinating insight into the popularity of tattoos among female celebrities. A quick look at the top 100 list reveals that one of the things that many of the women picked have in common is body art, i.e. tattoos. All right, is this plagiarism? You betcha. First of all, let's take this passage that the student wrote, and I use that term loosely, and see what it would look like if we italicized the original words and put in bold this student's words. The only thing that's different is the student added the phrase 2 years ago, took out the word how, took out the year 2002. They did not change anything. Removing the word how, removing the year, and adding in the phrase 2 years ago does not equal original writing. This is blatant plagiarism. It is word for word lifting it from the original source. And it's almost like they changed just a couple things up here right at the beginning to make it seem like they had paraphrased it. Maybe we wouldn't really pay attention to the rest because at least they started off a little bit different, but it's not enough. This is blatant plagiarism. Finally, there's no citation. So no matter what, even if the student had changed enough of the wording, they didn't provide a citation, so they didn't give credit to their source. It is plagiarism all around. Here's another scenario. Here's our original passage. Clearly, tattooing has emerged from the underbelly to the surface of the American landscape. And as the popularity of tattoos has expanded, so has the art itself. No longer restricted to Betty Page lookalikes, muddy blue anchors, and ribbon-wrapped hearts reading Mom, today's tattoo images make bold statements of personality, as individualized and varied as any art form. Okay. Student decides to use this information in their paper, and this is how they present it. It's a fact that tattoos have arisen from the underbelly to the top of the American landscape. Tattooing has experienced a growing popularity, and so has the art itself. It is no longer limited to sailor-style ships and blue anchors or biker-type hearts reading Mom. Today's images include bold statements of individualized personality as diverse as any art form. Is it plagiarism? So again, let's do this. We are going to italicize anything that came from the original passage, and we are going to put in bold anything that the student changed or added. This is what it would look like. So this is something that the student added or changed. This is straight from the original. This is something the student added or changed, but this straight from the original, straight from the original, straight from the original, straight from the original, straight from the original. It's still, the majority comes from the original passage exactly as it appeared in the first place. This student made a little bit more of an attempt than the previous student back here, but it's still not enough. Even with the citation, this is still plagiarism. You have to really work with your sources carefully, because you can't just change a few words here and there. But you also can't just use direct quote after direct quote after direct quote. Remember, you're only supposed to use direct quotes if the wording is so perfect or so complicated that it makes more sense to quote it directly instead of paraphrasing it. So knowing that you need to paraphrase more than anything, you have to really make sure that you understand what it means to paraphrase. That it is not just changing a couple of words here and there, that it is completely changing the original. You say the same thing, but in a completely different way. And even if you provide a citation, something like this is still plagiarism. Now, there are other ways that we can misuse our sources, okay? I give you a passage here that you can sort of use as a reference point. I come back to it a couple times, and you can do that on your own if you want. Read this passage and then see how it gets misused in different ways. But I'm just going to summarize, briefly explain each of these other source abuses that you need to be aware of. The first is using sources inaccurately, and this is when you get a quotation wrong, or when you get the summary wrong, or you paraphrase poorly, or you transpose numbers for statistics and data. It is when you simply don't actually give correct information from the source. You completely mess it up somehow. Make sure that you are understanding the sources you're using, that you fully understand the elements of each source that you're going to use, and make sure that it shows up accurately in the paper. Using source material out of context. This is when you rip a statement out of its context and force it into yours. You make the source say something it didn't really say. Sometimes the opposite of what it actually said. You know, this is sort of what tabloids do, or what gossip columns do, what some forms of media do. When a celebrity makes a statement, and then the next thing you know, you're seeing headlines or, you know, social media posts where it makes it seem like that celebrity said something super offensive, but it's because they only reported part of what was said, or maybe even like took only part of a sentence instead of a whole sentence that the person said, and makes it seem like it's something completely different. You don't want to do that. You don't want to overuse source material. This is when, even if it's different sources, it's when it's like just one citation after another. Like, you know, like look here at this example, right? We've got quote here, quote here, quote here, quote here, quote here. It's all from the same source. Everything that's in bold here is what the author added. Everything that's in it, you know, not in bold is what are the quotes. Now it's quoted, they're in quotation marks, so that's good. We have a citation, that's good. But this paragraph has virtually nothing of the student's ideas or words. Overusing source material. Remember, 80% of the essay is supposed to be your ideas and words, and only 20% should be coming from sources. This ain't gonna cut it. This is you. This is just copying what the source said, even if it's cited. It's not proper. Plunking quotations. This is when, you know, you're writing your paragraph, you know, and then you just insert a quote, and then after the quote, you keep going. Plunking it. It's like you just, here's your paragraph, and you just drop the quote in. You have to learn how to lead up to a quote, to integrate and introduce a quote, follow up on a quote. You don't want to just have it appear out of nowhere. And here's an example. So typically, characters such as Del Jordan, Louisa Dowd, and Almeida Roth experience a crisis through contact with particular men. Quote, they fight against and seek refuge in the people they love. Citation. This quote just comes out of nowhere. I don't really know how it connects to this sentence. How does it relate to this idea? I don't know. The author has not connected anything for me. They haven't integrated it. They haven't introduced it, and they didn't follow up on it. There's nothing after it to explain why is this quote even here. We can't plunk. We're going to work on integrating sources in week 5. We're going to practice that. Introducing, integrating, following up on. Blanket citations. Blanket citations is where you have a paragraph, and in that paragraph, you have referred to information from a source, maybe in more than one spot in that paragraph. And at the end of the paragraph is a citation. That's called a blanket citation because it's like, it's just, I'm going to put this citation here to just sort of cover the whole thing. right? Cover my base. No, because a citation should come immediately after the information that you use from that source. So if you have a citation at the end of your paragraph, that means it's the last sentence of your paragraph that came from that source. But a paragraph should never end with source information, because you're always supposed to wrap up a paragraph with your own ideas and including sentence, right? So that wouldn't make any sense. So you have to have the citation immediately after the information that you used from that source, not a blanket citation at the end of the paragraph. Relying too heavily on one source. You know, if you are writing a research paper that is 4 to 5 pages long and you have a required minimum 3 sources that you're using, there should not be one source that I see cited over and over and over and over and over again. And then the other 2 sources maybe get 1 citation each. You've relied too much on just one source. If you're required to use at least 3 sources, you should be using roughly equal amounts from each source. Roughly. Failing to match in-text citations to reference entries. We're going to learn about this in week 4, but on your references page, each of your sources will be listed, and each entry has to begin in a very specific way. Usually the author's last name. It is the first word of each entry that determines what goes in the parentheses of your citation. So if I see a citation that says Smith, 2020, and then I go to your reference page and I don't see an entry that begins with Smith, something is wrong. There should be an entry that begins with Smith if that's what's in your citation. Or Smith shouldn't have been in the citation. It should have been something else. So we're going to learn more about that, but just know that that is something you need to be very aware of too, that your citations need to match up with your reference entry. And by not doing so, that is another way of abusing or misusing your sources. Finally, we have double dipping and false staffing. Double dipping, kind of talked about this already. It's when you submit something for one class that you did for another class. False staffing is when you submit another student's work, even if it's a homework assignment. I know we're mostly talking about essays and research papers, but even just normal assignments, false staffing is not good. It can be it can be noticed and it can be penalized. What I hope you get from this whole thing here is just how important it is to treat your sources respectfully and appropriately and responsibly. All of the different ways that plagiarism can manifest, some that you may not have even really been aware of. And you need to really be honest with yourself, especially if you didn't know that some of those things were considered plagiarism, or the other source abuses that we just discussed. You have to, I would really advise that you think about these things. Be honest with yourself. You don't have to write anything down. You don't have to talk to me about it. You don't have to talk to anybody about it. Just reflect and think about how you have handled sources, or how you would have handled sources if you had not just learned all the different things that constitute plagiarism and all of the other source abuses that you need to avoid. And you need to think to yourself, ask yourself, have I done any of these things? Would I have done any of these things if I hadn't just watched that video? And then be mindful of that as you work on this course project and any future research papers, so that you do not commit those acts again, so that you are clear about what is plagiarism and how do I use sources appropriately, so that you don't run the risk of committing any of those acts of plagiarism or committing any of those source abuses. If you have questions, definitely reach out. I know, and this is, I really mean it with this lesson especially. If there is anything about plagiarism, other source abuses, using sources properly, if you have any questions about that, please reach out. Now, again, we will be learning more about how to actually use the sources, how to do a summary, how to do a paragraph, how to do a direct quote, how to integrate them, how to cite them. We will be covering that stuff. But if there is anything about the idea of plagiarism or using sources responsibly in general that you are still uncertain of, please reach out. Okay? Otherwise, feel free to go ahead and move on.